The glass door opened with a soft creak, and the flickering neon sign above greeted him. The faint smell of fried food lingered in the cool air, creating a sensation both familiar and strange. David Reeves entered, holding a tray of food, his head bowed like any regular customer. His attire, an old hoodie and faded jeans, made it impossible for anyone to guess that he was the CEO of a major restaurant chain. That was the point. No one looked at him twice. No one suspected. Near the cashier, a man stood silently, appearing tired and worn out. His hollow cheeks, his oversized jacket, couldn't hide the look of anticipation in his eyes. The voice of the person behind the buffet counter cut through the silence. "This is not a place for someone like you. Go outside, find somewhere else." The words hit like a slap, echoing through the still atmosphere of the restaurant. David stood still for a moment, his heart racing. He gripped the tray tightly, feeling each beat of his heart. He wasn't here to be a customer. He was here to check the real situation of the restaurant, to find the real issues that numbers and financial reports could never tell him. David had signed up under a fake name, Frank L. Through a secret reservation app, he had visited 13 branches across 3 states. The East Columbus restaurant, while not the worst, showed signs of decline. Revenue was down. Customer return rates were low. Employee turnover was high. He hadn't visited this branch in the 8 years since acquiring the chain. Although the food remained decent, like mashed potatoes and slow-cooked meat, he had been trying to pay wages above the minimum whenever possible. But now, standing face-to-face with the reality, he realized there was something deeply wrong with the company's culture. Meanwhile, a female employee at the salad bar, Tasha Green, stopped in her tracks, her face filled with disappointment. She watched the man eat slowly, each bite taken with no fear, only frustration. Silently, she took a small plate of hot food and placed it in the man's hand. "Thank you, keep it quiet," she whispered, and he responded with a soft, "Thank you." David stood motionless, watching the scene. A subtle yet clear shift had occurred in this space. This was the moment when silence began to make way for frustration. Just then, Chad, another employee, approached, his face flushed, slamming his spoon on the table. "Really, Tasha? You're going to feed all these people like that?" Tasha didn't turn around. She simply said calmly, "He's a human, Chad." David walked to the cashier, still holding his tray. "A buffet meal," he said softly. No one noticed him. He walked to a secluded corner by the window and sat down. From there, he observed everything. The man ate slowly, each bite chewed deliberately, as if to prolong the moment. Tasha returned to her station. Chad leaned against the counter, eyes glued to his phone. 15 minutes passed in silence. David stood up, walked over to the water machine, and poured a glass of cold water. "Hey," he said quietly to Tasha, "does he come here often?" She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Occasionally. He doesn't bother anyone. The management doesn't say anything unless someone complains." David nodded, a decision forming in his mind. He stood still for a moment, gazing out the window, the breeze gently making the neon sign flicker weakly. That night, when he returned to his room, thoughts about what he had witnessed today kept swirling in his mind. The company was not just numbers on a report. It was the stories of the people in these very spaces. The next morning, the air was cold and damp, enveloping the city. Puddles from the night's rain reflected the faint light from the street lamps. David parked his car near the back door of the restaurant. He stepped out, holding a cup of hot coffee, his face showing no emotion. Today was not like any other day. Today, he would no longer be just a CEO overseeing the company from afar. Today, he would take part directly in the change he wanted to see. David paused for a moment before entering. He looked at the flickering neon sign above the door, the light fluctuating unevenly, like a symbol of exhaustion, of the decline that could no longer be hidden. He took a deep breath and walked inside. The door swung open, and the cold air from the restaurant greeted him, silent and still. The familiar sounds of early morning work filled the space. The hum of the refrigerator, the clink of dishes, the rhythmic clattering of spoons and pans from the kitchen. The staff were all present, but no one paid any attention to David. He walked straight into the staff changing room, where everything was just as he had left it the night before. Tasha was at the salad bar, smiling softly at him without saying a word. She continued her work, unhurried, not rushing. Everything was unfolding naturally, as if nothing had changed since yesterday. But David knew everything had changed, at least in his mind. He walked straight into the staff break room. There was no chatter, just the quiet of the place. Everyone looked at him for a moment, a bit confused, but no one said anything. David sighed, then looked at the old posters on the bulletin board, the faded images of dishes and memories of a time when this restaurant was busier. Mara, the manager of the restaurant, entered through the back door. She stopped when she saw David. She hadn't expected him to show up today, but her gaze wasn't filled with anxiety or surprise. David looked at her, took a sip of his coffee, and began. "Yesterday, when I came here, I saw something I can't ignore anymore," he said, his voice calm but full of conviction. Mara looked down, saying nothing. David continued, "This isn't just about food or business numbers. It's about the company culture, the way our staff treats each other, the way we treat customers. There was a man yesterday, he only needed a meal, but he was treated as if he didn't belong here." The events from yesterday flashed back in Mara's mind. She looked directly into David's eyes. I didn't know about that." David nodded. "I know because you weren't there. But Mara, do you know that there are people in your team shaping this culture? He was hurt simply because he was in a difficult situation, and you, as the one in charge of this environment, are responsible for it." Mara remained silent, looking down at her hand, silently acknowledging the truth. David didn't want to say more. He just needed to adjust this culture, starting with himself. "Chad can't continue here," David said firmly, without hesitation. Mara looked up, her face confused and somewhat surprised. But David didn't wait for her to ask questions. He just continued. "He's not just an ordinary employee. He's the one who's created this environment, who's devalued the company. And now I want to change that." Mara took a deep breath, looked straight at David, then nodded. "Understood. I'll follow your instructions." Just then, the door opened with a soft creak. The room fell silent, all eyes on the door. The man from yesterday had returned. He wasn't standing outside anymore, but was now holding a small bag, seemingly a gift from where he came from. He stood silently, looking at the quiet space in the room, then said softly, "I just want to thank you. I know I didn't deserve a free meal, but I just wanted to say thank you. I brought some pastries from my shelter, though they're not fresh, but it's all I can do." His words created a silence that enveloped the room. Chad, from behind the food counter, exhaled sharply, his lips pressed tightly together. He wasn't happy with the man's presence, but David, looking directly at him, then turned back to the staff. "Thank you for doing the right thing, but this isn't your fault. You're not the one to blame," David said gently, but with certainty. He turned to face all the staff, his eyes stopping at Tasha, who had stood up and done the right thing. "Thank you for doing the right thing. Tasha, from today, you'll be the lead server and you'll start the management training program." That one quiet sentence transformed the atmosphere in the room. Tasha didn't say anything, but her eyes lit up, not from praise, but because she understood that she had truly done the right thing, and everything would change from now on. Yesterday's story was now just the beginning of much bigger changes. David didn't need to give a long speech or make grand promises. He just needed to show up at the right moment, face things directly, and change a company culture that had long been neglected. The next morning, the restaurant glowed brightly under the neon lights, no longer dim like the day before. David stood at the front door, observing the scene inside. Everything seemed to have settled, but he knew that what mattered wasn't just the outward stability, but the deeper changes in each person and how they worked together. He stepped inside, holding a cup of hot coffee, his eyes scanning every corner of the restaurant. Tasha was already there, checking each dish, wiping down tables, and guiding new staff with a calm demeanor. Luis was at the salad bar, moving slowly but surely, no longer rushing or anxious like before. Everything was flowing like an unsung melody, smooth and effortless. David could feel the shift in the atmosphere. There were no raised voices, no tension in the words or actions. People were working together as a real team now, no longer divided or struggling for power. Mara was also there early, observing and carefully monitoring every step. The difference in the way she worked compared to the previous days was obvious. There were no sidelong glances, no avoiding responsibility. She had started to truly embrace her role as a manager and a leader. As customers began to arrive, the atmosphere in the restaurant felt warmer. The greetings from the staff came with genuine smiles. Tasha stood at the reception desk, polite but confident. She was no longer just a server. She was now the bridge between customers and the restaurant, ensuring everything flowed smoothly. David sat in a corner, continuing to observe, but he didn't need to intervene. Everything had started to function on its own. Every now and then, he glanced toward Mara, who was guiding new employees and giving clear instructions. There was no rush. She wasn't trying to get through tasks quickly. She was taking her time to ensure everything was done right. When he saw Tasha helping an elderly customer bring their food to the table, he thought back to his own early days when he started in the business. Those were the days when he had to do everything himself with no one to rely on. Now, seeing his team operate so smoothly, he felt proud, not because of the short-term improvements, but because people like Tasha and Mara truly understood the importance of teamwork and the value of a company that's measured not just by profit, but by its people. Mara came over to David while he was sitting in the corner. Her face no longer held the signs of exhaustion or anxiety. "Everything's running more smoothly than yesterday," she said, her voice still a bit tense but filled with hope. David smiled and nodded. "That's thanks to you and the team. But don't forget, don't stop now. We still have a lot to do." Mara sighed softly but smiled, her eyes lighting up as she looked at the team preparing for the next shift. "I get it. And thank you, David. I never thought I'd be able to do this." "Not just you. All of us," David replied, his voice calm but full of certainty. Later that day, as the restaurant quieted down and the last of the customers began to leave, David took a moment to reflect. Standing in the corner, watching the team work, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: peace. They weren't just doing their jobs anymore. They were doing something more, building something together. David knew that the road ahead was still long, but today he had made the right decision by trusting his team to rebuild what had been broken. This was just the beginning. The foundation had been laid, but there was still much to be done. The change was slow, but it was real. The restaurant was no longer just a place for food. It was becoming a community, a place where everyone worked toward the same goal. As the last of the staff cleaned up, David stepped outside into the cool evening air, feeling a quiet pride. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today he had done the right thing. Not just for the restaurant, but for his team. They were ready, and he was ready to face whatever came next with them. The day slowly passed, and David felt a more noticeable change than ever before. The atmosphere in the restaurant was different. It was not just a stable workflow, but a new spirit, full of unity. Yet, as everyone knew, when things start to settle, the challenges are just around the corner, ready to test the strength of what has been built. As the calm waves slowly passed, David sensed a quiet but palpable tension in the air. The newer staff members seemed to have found their rhythm, but the longtime employees, like Mara and Tasha, were still struggling to fully shed the old mindset, where everything needed to be controlled and ordered step by step. They had made progress, but now they faced a bigger challenge ahead. Tasha walked through the kitchen area, the light from the overhead lamps reflecting on her face, creating an unusual calmness. She no longer moved hurriedly, as she did before. Now she walked with a newfound confidence. Although she had matured, she still couldn't avoid the occasional small feelings of anxiety whenever she had to make an important decision. A new employee, a young man named Dylan, had just come out of the dining area, holding an empty plate. He glanced down at the plate in his hands and then looked up, noticing David standing by the counter. His eyes brightened when he saw David, but a bit of awkwardness still lingered. David smiled at him, gently asking, "Dylan, is something wrong?" Dylan glanced down at the plate, hesitating before responding. "Oh, it's nothing, David. I'm just trying to remember the procedure for the new dishes." David nodded, then moved closer. "The procedure is important, but don't forget that we also need creativity and flexibility. Not everything will always go according to plan, but it's the decisiveness and initiative that will help us manage situations." Dylan felt reassured by David's words. Yes, he had learned many things from the team, but he still needed time to truly grasp the importance of everything happening around him. Hours later, as the lunchtime rush slowly died down, David sat at the counter, still watching the team. Mara stood in the kitchen corner, confidently supervising the new staff. Tasha was chatting with a regular customer, her smile spreading warmth to everyone. But then, as the doorbell chimed, David noticed an uninvited guest. A man in a business suit, his face tense, walked up to the counter with a cold demeanor. He was an auditor, here to address the restaurant's financial issues. Mara immediately recognized him and smiled, but there was a trace of concern in her eyes. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. Their team had worked hard, but this financial audit would be the next test, especially when financial issues could shake everything they had built. David walked up to him with his usual calmness. He extended his hand for a handshake and smiled. "Hello, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm David, the manager here. Thank you for coming." The man in the business suit stared at David, his eyes filled with skepticism. "I've heard that this restaurant is facing issues with revenue, and the financial situation isn't stable. We're here to look into the details. I hope there won't be any surprises." David didn't falter. He knew he was facing a major challenge, but instead of feeling nervous, he felt a deep sense of determination. "Of course, we've prepared everything for the audit. Please follow me." With a quick glance at the team, David saw Mara and Tasha watching, not with fear, but with readiness. They had made it through one challenge, and this was just the next. David understood that, though there were more difficulties ahead, if they stayed confident in what they had built, they would overcome it all. The financial audit went on in a tense but controlled atmosphere. David, along with Mara and Tasha, had prepared all the necessary documents, the reports clear and transparent. The auditor couldn't help but be surprised at how well everything was organized. Finally, after the audit, the auditor silently signed off on the documents and stood up. "I didn't find any major issues. Everything's fairly clear. Congratulations on managing the finances well." David felt a weight lift off his shoulders. It was a small victory, but an important one. What he realized, though, was that the team had learned how to stand firm and take control of situations, not just with the numbers, but with their actions. "We did it," David whispered to himself as the auditor walked out the door. The feeling inside him was different. It wasn't just relief, but a belief in the team that had grown stronger. David stood still for a moment, looking at the team. They were ready. Not only had they overcome difficulties, but they were also prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a golden hue over the scattered buildings outside the window. David sat at the table, holding a cup of hot coffee, listening to the subtle sounds of the morning. Today was a new day, but he could already feel that the atmosphere in the restaurant had changed. It wasn't just about the outward changes in workflow, but also the shift in attitude and mindset of everyone involved. Yesterday had left a significant mark. The small steps, the gradual but lasting changes, were now becoming evident. Tasha had gradually mastered her role and understood the importance of listening and leading the team. Mara, although still slightly tense, had learned to take initiative. She was no longer just a manager. She had become a source of inspiration. The new staff members were gaining confidence, and even those who had been around longer, like Luis, began to view their work with a different mindset. David knew that this couldn't be achieved overnight, but he also understood that each small step laid a solid foundation. This wasn't a story about a leader at the forefront, but about a team that had learned to collaborate, support each other, and move towards success together. This morning, like every other day, David arrived early to check on things. He stood at the door, watching the restaurant from inside. There was no more sense of rushing or tension. Tasha stood at the counter, holding a notebook, jotting down what needed to be prepared for the new shift. She looked up and smiled when she saw David. "Good morning, David. Everything looks much better today," she said, her voice calm but confident. "So you're noticing the difference then?" David replied, his eyes still scanning the staff as they prepared for the morning rush. "I see the difference in how they're working, but more importantly, you've seen the difference in yourself." Tasha nodded, her eyes brightening. She knew that today marked a turning point for the team. It wasn't just about preparing for a new shift. It was about each person on the team understanding their role and taking ownership of it. David moved through the restaurant, carefully observing everything. Luis was working in the kitchen area, fast but precise, ensuring every detail was in place. Mara, after finishing her administrative tasks, was now helping the kitchen staff. Everything seemed to flow in perfect harmony, and no one had to be told what to do. The teamwork was seamless. David stepped into the staff changing room, where the employees were getting ready for their shift. He saw Mara rearranging a few documents, but there was no sense of rushing or stress anymore. "Mara, how are you feeling?" David asked, his tone warm but serious. Mara looked up at him, then smiled. For the first time in a long while, she felt at ease. "It feels like everything is finally falling into place. I don't feel like I have to do everything on my own anymore. I'm learning to trust the team and know we can do this together." David nodded proudly, recognizing the change in her. He knew that everyone on the team now understood that success didn't come from a single person, but from the collective effort of the whole team. As the morning wore on, David continued to observe, but he didn't need to step in. Tasha had taken charge of her responsibilities. Mara was confidently leading the team, and Luis no longer felt isolated in his work. A small but powerful change had taken place within the team, one that was steadily growing into something bigger. David sat down in a corner, watching his team, and realized that he had finally created the environment he had been striving for. This was a place where each person felt valued and could contribute to something greater than themselves. The restaurant was no longer just a place to earn money. It was becoming a community where everyone worked toward a shared goal. Later in the day, when a couple of customers left, an elderly couple stopped by the door, turned to Tasha and said, "Thank you so much. The service today was wonderful." Tasha smiled, not with pride, but with a sense of humility. She simply replied, "Thank you for coming." At that moment, David felt a small sense of pride in his heart. It wasn't a pride in the numbers or achievements, but in seeing his team not only working well, but working with passion and sincerity. Tasha, Luis, Mara, and everyone else in the team had learned something important. They were not just workers in a large system, but individuals with value, and when they worked together, they could make a difference. Not just for the restaurant, but for their own lives. With all these changes, David now clearly saw the transformation of the restaurant from a place serving food to a community, where everyone worked together for a common goal. And this, he knew, was the true success. As the shift ended, David stepped outside into the cool evening air, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today, he had done the right thing. Not just for the restaurant, but for his team. They were ready, and he was ready to face whatever came next with them. The day continued to pass, and David felt more clearly than ever the changes that were unfolding. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted. It wasn't just about the stability in work, but also a fresh new spirit full of unity. Yet, as everyone knows, when things begin to settle, challenges are always waiting around the corner, ready to test the strength of what has been built. As the calm wave of progress passed, David sensed a quiet but palpable tension in the air. The new staff members seemed to have adjusted to the workflow, but the long-term employees like Mara and Tasha were still struggling to completely shed the old mindset. The mindset where everything had to be controlled and ordered step by step. They had made progress, but now they were facing bigger challenges ahead. When Tasha walked through the kitchen area, the light from the overhead lamps reflected on her face, creating an unusual calmness. She no longer rushed like she did before. She moved with a newfound confidence. Although she had matured, she still couldn't avoid the small feelings of anxiety whenever she had to make an important decision. A new employee, a young man named Dylan, came out from the dining area, holding an empty plate. He looked down at the plate in his hand and then looked up, noticing David standing at the counter. His eyes brightened when he saw David, but a little awkwardness still lingered. David smiled at him, gently asking, "Dylan, is something wrong?" Dylan glanced down at the plate, hesitated for a moment, and then answered, "Oh, it's nothing, David. I'm just trying to remember the procedure for the new dishes." David nodded and moved a little closer. "The procedure is important, but don't forget that we also need creativity and flexibility. Not everything will always go according to plan, but it's decisiveness and initiative that will help us manage situations." Dylan felt reassured by David's words. Yes, he had learned a lot from the team, but he still needed time to fully understand the importance of everything happening around him. A few hours later, as the lunchtime rush began to slow down, David sat at the counter, continuing to watch his team. Mara was in the kitchen corner, confidently overseeing the new staff. Tasha was chatting with a regular customer, her smile spreading warmth to everyone. But then, when the doorbell rang, David noticed an uninvited guest. A man in a business suit with a tense expression walked toward the counter with a cold demeanor. He was an auditor, here to address the restaurant's financial issues. Mara immediately recognized him and smiled, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. The team had worked hard, but this financial audit would be the next test, especially since financial issues could shake everything they had built. David walked up to the man with his usual calm demeanor. He extended his hand to shake and smiled. "Hello, sir. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm David, the manager here. Thank you for coming." The man in the business suit stared at David, his eyes filled with skepticism. "I've heard that this restaurant is facing issues with revenue and that the financial situation isn't stable. We're here to look into the details. I hope there won't be any surprises." David didn't waver. He knew he was facing a major challenge, but instead of feeling nervous, he felt a deep sense of determination. "Of course, we've prepared everything for the audit. Please follow me." With a quick glance at his team, David saw that Mara and Tasha were watching, not with fear, but with readiness. They had made it through one challenge, and this was just the next. David understood that while there were more difficulties ahead, if they stayed confident in what they had built, they would overcome everything. The financial audit went on in a tense but controlled atmosphere. David, along with Mara and Tasha, had prepared all the necessary documents, with the reports clear and transparent. The auditor was somewhat surprised by how organized everything was. Finally, after the audit, the auditor silently signed the documents and stood up. "I didn't find any major issues. Everything's pretty clear. Congratulations on managing the finances well." David felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a major victory, but it was an important one. What he realized, though, was that the team had learned how to stand strong and take control of situations, not just with numbers, but with their actions. "We did it," David whispered to himself as the auditor walked out the door. The feeling inside him was different. It wasn't just relief, but a belief in the team that had grown stronger. David stood still for a moment, looking at his team. They were ready. Not only had they overcome difficulties, but they were also prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead. As the day went on, the atmosphere in the restaurant remained surprisingly steady. The team had grown accustomed to the new rhythm of work, no longer rushing or feeling anxious like before. Their movements had become more fluid and precise, as though they had found a new sense of harmony. David stood behind the counter, observing every movement without interfering too much. Everything was unfolding naturally. Tasha, now promoted to the head server, moved between the tables, greeting customers with a warm smile, helping out wherever needed, without the need for constant reminders. She exuded more confidence in her role, clearly showing the shift in how she interacted with customers and coworkers. Each step she took gave off a sense of assurance, something she hadn't had before. Luis, although still dealing with some issues with his legs, was working more efficiently than ever. Today, he wasn't just doing his own job accurately, but he had also started guiding the new employees. Each time he delegated a task to a colleague, his voice no longer sounded stiff or anxious. He had truly become an integral part of the team, not just a skilled worker, but a quiet leader, guiding others through his actions. Mara, with all the changes in her management style, was also beginning to feel the transformation. She no longer hid behind piles of paperwork in her office, but actively participated in every aspect, from checking on each shift to directly assisting the staff. This wasn't just improving work efficiency, but it was creating a closer, friendlier work environment. The new employees, from the servers to the kitchen staff, could feel her support and care for them, something they had never experienced before. A week had passed and the restaurant's performance seemed to have noticeably improved. The customers who came in didn't just find good food, they also felt the change in the service. Compliments from customers started to come more frequently. Some returned not just because of the food, but because they felt respected and properly cared for. Even though there were still many challenges ahead, David felt a sense of peace. He had seen the growth of his team, and more importantly, he had created an environment where everyone felt like they were a part of something bigger than just the paycheck. It was a community where they weren't just working for money, but for a shared ideal: respect, kindness, and fairness. One afternoon, as he stood behind the bar watching his team at work, David realized something he had forgotten for a long time. This restaurant, this business, wasn't just a place to make money. Yes, profit was essential, but the people, the empathy, and the company culture were what truly mattered and were sustainable in the long run. When Tasha brought him a cup of coffee and sat next to him, she asked, "How do you feel about everything?" David looked up, smiled softly, and answered, "It feels really good, Tasha. We're on the right track, but don't forget, this is just the beginning. We still have a long way to go." Tasha looked at him, then turned her gaze to the team at work. She nodded gently and said, "I know, but I think we have a solid foundation now." She stood up, ready to return to her duties. David followed her, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. This was the moment he had been waiting for. The next day, when the restaurant opened again, the atmosphere had changed noticeably. Even though it was only small details, the positive transformations began to spread throughout the restaurant. The entire team, from servers to chefs, could feel the difference in how they worked. Tasha, in her new role as head server, was no longer just overseeing the work, but had truly become a role model for everyone. She wasn't just guiding, she was also listening and offering solutions to any issues that came up during the day. Every decision was shared and discussed, making everyone feel more connected to the work. Luis, after a few days of adjustments, was back to working efficiently, and he had also begun to play an important role in training the new staff. His passing on of experience wasn't just about the job itself, but also about the culture David was building. Luis was no longer just a quiet worker in the background. He had become a leader, with confidence and assurance in his actions. Mara gradually had also changed. She no longer hid behind piles of work in the office, but was actively involved in everything, from checking shifts to directly assisting the staff. This not only improved work efficiency, but also created a closer and more friendly work environment. The new staff, from the servers to the kitchen, could feel her concern and support, something they had never experienced before. A week passed, and the restaurant's performance seemed to improve significantly. Customers who came in didn't just find good food, but they also felt the change in the service. Compliments from customers began to increase. Some returned, not just for the food, but because they felt respected and well cared for. Although there were still many challenges ahead, David felt a sense of peace. He had seen the growth of his team, and more importantly, he had created an environment where everyone felt like they were part of something bigger than just a paycheck. It was a community where they weren't just working for money, but for a shared ideal: respect, kindness, and fairness. One afternoon, when he stood by the counter watching his team at work, David suddenly realized something he had forgotten for a long time. This restaurant, this business, wasn't just a place to make money. Yes, profit was important, but the people, the empathy, and the company culture were what truly mattered. And those were the things that would sustain them in the long run. When Tasha brought him a cup of coffee and sat next to him, she asked, "How do you feel about everything?" David looked up, smiled gently, and replied, "It feels really good, Tasha. We're on the right track. But don't forget, this is just the beginning. We still have a long journey ahead." Tasha looked at him, then turned her gaze back to the team. She nodded slowly and said, "I know, but I think we've built a solid foundation now." She stood up, ready to go back to work. David stood up after her, feeling a peace he hadn't felt in a long time. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.